The struggle with compulsive sexual behavior is often shrouded in a nocturnal silence, punctuated by the self-recriminating question, "Why can I not stop?" Each capitulation to temptation deepens a sense of hollowness, reinforcing a narrative of moral failure and intractable addiction. However, a more profound diagnosis suggests that this cycle may not be rooted in a simple addiction to lust, but rather in a profound and unmet hunger for intimacy. This perspective reframes the problem not as a defect of will, but as a misguided search for connection. The compulsive act becomes a symptom of a deeper existential ache, a desperate attempt to fill a void that physical sensation alone cannot occupy. The immediate psychological objective is to disrupt the familiar pattern of shame by proposing that the core issue is not a craving for transgression, but a starvation for genuine, non-judgmental human and divine connection. To understand this dynamic, one can employ the metaphor of a trembling heart, reaching for a luminous fruit in an otherwise desolate landscape. The object of desire promises nourishment, sweetness, and relief from the darkness of solitude. This anticipated satisfaction, fueled by powerful neurochemical responses, drives the individual toward the act. Yet, upon consumption, the promise dissolves into something insubstantial and bitter, leaving behind only the residue of shame and an intensified sense of emptiness. It turns to ash. This allegorical sequence illustrates the deceptive nature of lust. It offers an illusory form of union, a counterfeit of the intimacy the soul truly craves. The act, therefore, is not the fulfillment of a desire, but its perversion, a moment where the search for life leads paradoxically to a state of spiritual desolation and inner fragmentation. This internal conflict is not a mere theoretical construct, but a lived reality for many. The solitary glow of a screen in a dark room becomes a recurring tableau of this struggle, a private theater where a drama of momentary gratification and subsequent despair unfolds. The fleeting pleasure, often pursued not for its own sake but as a palliative for loneliness, vanishes almost as soon as it arrives, leaving the individual more isolated than before. The underlying motivation in this cycle is often not the pursuit of sin itself, but the search for a form of acceptance, an embrace, whether literal or metaphorical, that is free from contempt and judgment. It represents a profound yearning for unconditional positive regard, a desire to be known and accepted without the prerequisite of performance or perfection. When this legitimate need is unmet in healthy relational contexts, it seeks its fulfillment in clandestine and ultimately self-defeating ways. At a neurobiological level, this behavior is driven by the brain's reward system, particularly the release of dopamine, which creates a powerful feedback loop reinforcing the activity. However, a purely physiological explanation is insufficient. The brain is not fundamentally addicted to the sexual act itself, but to the fleeting sensation of connection and escape that it provides. Dopamine, in this context, functions as a temporary analgesic for the chronic pain of isolation and existential loneliness. The true addiction is to the temporary quieting of a deeper spiritual cry, the soul's primal need to be seen, to be known, and to be valued. This cry, when unanswered by authentic relationship, echoes in the chambers of the psyche, and the individual turns to any available anesthetic to silence its persistent and painful call. The critical insight in resolving this conflict lies in reframing the nature of lust. It is not primarily a fire of rebellion or transgression, but rather a misdirected signal, the desperate flicker of a heart famished for love. It is a legitimate and powerful thirst for union and intimacy that has been aimed at a source incapable of quenching it. Christian theology posits that this profound existential thirst can only be truly and permanently satisfied by a relationship with its intended source, the divine. This reorientation is captured in the words of Christ, "Whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst." John 4:14. This proposes that the ultimate solution is not merely the suppression of a negative desire, but its redirection and fulfillment in a transcendent relationship that provides the living water for which the soul was created. The journey of transformation is seldom instantaneous. It often begins in a state of spiritual aridity, a personal desert where old habits have depleted all moisture. However, each act of honesty and each choice for life-giving alternatives acts like a single drop of water on the parched ground. Over time, these small acts of faithful resistance begin to form a wellspring of new life. As the soul is increasingly nourished by authentic connection with God and community, the once raging fire of disordered desire begins to diminish. It is not simply extinguished, but is gradually transmuted into a different kind of fire, the steady, warming, and enduring flame of sanctified love, agape. This process represents a fundamental reordering of the affections, where the desperate search for fleeting pleasure is replaced by the quiet cultivation of lasting joy. This transformative journey reveals a profound truth about the nature of spiritual liberty. True freedom is not the complete absence of struggle or the eradication of temptation. Rather, it is the abiding presence of God within the struggle. The fight itself becomes a hallowed space for intimacy with the divine, where personal weakness becomes the occasion for experiencing supernatural strength. This perspective radically redefines the human condition. One is not seen as fundamentally corrupt or irreparably broken, but as profoundly hungry for a love that the world cannot provide. The struggle, therefore, is not a sign of failure, but an invitation to depend more deeply on a grace that is sufficient for every need. This healing process is inherently communal, demanding a shift in perspective from an isolated I to a connected we. Individualistic approaches to spiritual growth are inadequate for overcoming sins of isolation. Recovery is fostered within a community of fellow strugglers, a collective of broken hearts learning to love again. In the context of the Christian faith, the church, ecclesia, is intended to be this therapeutic community where the shame of the individual is absorbed into the grace of the collective. No one on this journey is meant to be alone. Each prayer offered, each vulnerability shared, and each act of mutual encouragement becomes a small light that illuminates the path for others, creating a network of support that makes the solitary battle a shared pilgrimage. Ultimately, the cycle that begins in the lonely whisper of despair can be brought to a redemptive close. For those who have grown weary of drinking from broken cisterns that can hold no water, there is a standing invitation to come to the inexhaustible source of life. The central message of the gospel is that divine grace is more powerful than any chain, and forgiveness is more profound than any failure. The very place where an individual feels most weak, most ashamed, and most defeated is precisely the place where God's healing power is most eager to begin its work. Confession, in this light, is not a declaration of weakness. It is the first strategic move in a war for the soul, a defiant act of hope that chooses the vulnerability of the light over the false safety of the darkness.